Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus presentation. I'm Joan Goldberg, Executive Director of the American Society for Cell Biology. We're a member of the Coalition for the Life Sciences, which helps to support these briefings. I also want to thank the caucus co-chairs, Representatives Brian Gilbreth, Mike Castle, Jackie Spear, and Rush Holt, and their staffs, some who I see in this room, for their help and their commitment and ongoing support to these caucuses. Last, I'd like to thank the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Without its generous grant, these caucuses would also not be possible. I also want to remind people, and especially those for whom it's your first time here, that we do videotape every presentation. You can find past presentations on the CLS website, www.coalitionforlifesciences.org. You can also register for the RSS feed if you'd like to be alerted to future postings. And just a reminder, next week we'll be holding another caucus, same time, same day, in Rayburn B369 on the H1N1 influenza, where we stand. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Charmane Eastman. She's been studying circadian rhythms for over 30 years, as well as sleep. Circadian rhythms, as most of you know, are biological rhythms. And Dr. Eastman received her PhD from the University of Chicago. In 1987, she established the Biological Rhythms Research Laboratory at the Rush University Medical Center. She spent years performing studies on seasonal affective disorder using bright light treatment. And in 1991, she designed the bright light and sleep schedules that were used to reset the circadian clocks of astronauts before space shuttle launches. Those procedures are still in use today. Current research focuses on how to reset or phase shift circadian rhythms using bright light and melatonin to alleviate the problems of jet lag and shift work. She has over 90 publications in prestigious journals. Her research has been primarily supported by grants from the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Today, Dr. Eastman will explain what circadian rhythms are. Turned out we all have rhythm. Why we get jet lag, and what research tells us about jet lag management. I know she'll be happy to answer your questions after her talk. Dr. Eastman?
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here. You probably know the symptoms of jet lag. This is from a survey of business travelers, and their biggest complaint was poor sleep, also fatigue. They admitted to decreased mental performance, drowsiness, irritability, and some had digestive problems. I've heard that called gut lag. And about a third regularly took sleeping pills. Aside from those symptoms, jet lag can be a serious health problem, as shown by this study. Chronic jet lag produces temporal lobe atrophy and spatial cognitive deficits. That just means jet lag shrinks your brain and makes you stupider. This was very popular with the media. This study, jet lag shortens lifespan of older mice. And it made the front page of the business section of the Washington Post. And I just love this cartoon they made for it. So here you see this flight attendant bringing bottles of melatonin and cups of coffee, and they're strewn on the floor. So I'm going to show you a figure from the actual study. And the mice had their light-dark cycles shifted 6 hours once a week. And there are the animals who did not have their light-dark cycle shifted. So being shifted 6 hours is like going across 6 time zones. So the animals who didn't shift died off a little bit. So that's the natural death rate. And those who went 6 hours west died off much sooner. And those who went 6 hours east died off much, much sooner. So it's worse to go east than it is to go west. And that's true for humans too. So So we have the most jet lag if we go east, the least if we go west. If you go north and south, you won't have jet lag because you're not crossing time zones. You might have travel fatigue from long flights or being sleep deprived. But that you can get over sooner than jet lag. If you go east and west, you might also have travel fatigue. So you'll have jet lag plus travel fatigue. Why is it more difficult to go east? Well, when you go east, you have to go to bed earlier, which is more difficult than going to bed later, which is what you do when you go west, and what you usually do on the weekends. You go to bed later and wake up later. Many of us do. So let's say you go to Israel and it's 11 p.m. and it's time for bed. Well, it's only 4 p.m. here. So you have to go to sleep and stay asleep at 4 p.m., which is very difficult unless you're very sleep deprived. Humans, like all animals, when put into temporal isolation, no clocks, no windows, no TV, no radio, no time cues. Free run with a period that is not exactly 24 hours. So here's one of the first examples of a free-running human. And this is from the underground bunkers in Germany. And people went down in the bunkers and lived for about a month, never talking to another person or seeing another person. So this subject went to bed and woke up about 1 hour later every day, even though he thought he was following his usual 24-hour routine. So he had a free-running period of about 25 hours. So the period of our endogenous circadian clock is usually longer than 24 hours, and that's part of why it's easier to get later or delay than to get earlier or advance. Here are the free-running periods of 73 subjects run in our lab. We don't have an underground bunker, but we have an efficient way to determine each person's free-running period. So you can see most of them are longer. There's a few less than 24 hours and some at 24 hours, but mostly they're longer. If you have a very short free-running period, it makes you an early bird. If you have a very long free-running period, it makes you a night owl. I'm going to show you a figure from a hamster study, a favorite rhythm animal. This shows slower recovery from jet lag in old hamsters. So after flying west over 4 time zones, it took old hamsters many more days to adjust than young hamsters. So here you can see the circadian phase at baseline. And day 0, they shifted the light-dark cycle 4 hours. So the young animals gradually adjusted, got there by about day 10. But the old took much longer. We don't know if the same difference is true in humans. More research is needed to study jet lag in old versus young humans. We do know that young people get jet lag. And maybe you don't hear about Lady Gaga. I can't say I do. But here's Hillary, who flies a lot, talking about jet lag. And I think you'll agree it's important for our diplomats, our congressmen, our military generals to get to their destinations without jet lag. And there is a way to completely avoid jet lag, a forgotten method. Take a boat. If you go slow enough, you won't have jet lag. Well, later, actually, I will show you some more practical ways to avoid jet lag. First, some more circadian rhythm principles. So the signal from the body clock, the circadian clock, controls sleepiness, when we sleep, alertness, performance, body temperature, hormones, neurotransmitters, everything that you measure has a circadian rhythm. So this red sine wave represents the circadian rhythm of body temperature. And we're the most sleepy and the most prone to accidents around the low point of the temperature cycle. And we mark that low point with a triangle. Sometimes I call it temperature minimum, sometimes I say T-min, sometimes I just say triangle. That's what I mean. Here it is around 5 a.m., which is kind of normal for young adults. And usually we're asleep around the temperature minimum, so that's good. It's a good time to sleep. If you try to stay awake at that time, then you're asking for trouble. The circadian clock is very stubborn and difficult to move. It's difficult to reset, difficult to phase shift. But bright light and melatonin can help reset the circadian clock. This is the way we administer bright light in the lab, with a single light box with ordinary fluorescent bulbs or lamps. And you can use a light box at work or at home. They come in many different sizes and shapes. I prefer larger ones. You can get this one at Walmart. You can get this blue one at Amazon.com. But it's so small that you have to be careful to aim it properly, because if it doesn't shine in the eyes, it's not going to work. And I think the next slide is going to show you the best kind of light to get. Sunlight. Even on a cloudy day, it's more intense than anything you can get from a light box. And the more intense the light, then the bigger the phase shift. It's like a bigger dose of a drug. We also use melatonin in the lab. Melatonin comes in lots of different doses. It comes in pills, liquids, chewable tablets. You can get it in the drugstore. You can get it online. It comes in from many different brands. And just like vitamins, you should buy it from a brand that you trust. What is melatonin? Melatonin is an old molecule, perhaps one of the first on Earth. It's secreted at night in both nocturnal and diurnal mammals, so it's been called the hormone of darkness. And the duration of the time that it's in the body is shaped by the length of the night. So it transmits night length to the body. So it tells animals when to mate, when to grow their antlers, when to shed their winter coat, photoperiodic responses like that. It's soporific in humans, not a sedative or hypnotic. It makes some people sleepy, especially at high doses, but I wouldn't call it a sleeping pill. And practically the only side effect of melatonin is that it makes you sleepy. So if you take it at night for its little bit of sleep-promoting effect, then maybe you wouldn't call that a side effect. But in many cases for jet lag, sleepiness is an unwanted side effect. Melatonin is a chronobiotic. It resets or phase shifts the circadian clock. That's what I'll be talking about today a lot. It's an antioxidant, a free radical scavenger. It boosts the immune system. It prevents cancer. It extends life. It makes you young and beautiful and rich. Okay. I'm kidding, but actually there is evidence for 8 through 11, but I'm not talking about that today. So bright light and melatonin can help reset or phase shift the circadian clock, but the direction the clock is reset. Whether it's made earlier, which we call an advance, which you can think of as going left along a timeline, or whether it's made later, which we call a delay. And the magnitude, the size of the shift depends on what time the bright light or melatonin is administered. So this is how it works. Please get used to this timeline because you're going to see it a lot. From noon to noon with midnight in the middle. And I picked an example sleep schedule to use from 11 p.m. till 6 a.m. with a temperature minimum around 4 a.m., which would be typical for that schedule. So light after the temperature minimum at the end of sleep and in the morning makes you earlier. And light late at night and the beginning of sleep makes you later. So the same stimulus can have an opposite effect. The same intensity and duration of light can shift you one way when you see it at one time and the opposite way when you see it at another time. So the temperature minimum is important for 3 reasons. It marks the sleepiest time of day. It's an approximation of the crossover point from when light makes you later to when it makes you earlier. And it's a phase marker for the time of the circadian clock, which you'll see more of soon. Light in the middle of the day doesn't do that much. We call that the dead zone. So light has the biggest effect at night when the circadian clock is not expecting it. Melatonin at the end of sleep and in the morning makes you later, and melatonin in the afternoon makes you earlier. And in between, it doesn't have much of a phase shifting effect. And that's when melatonin is naturally in the body. So just like light, melatonin has the biggest effect when the circadian clock is not expecting it. So these times that you see for when to take melatonin or get light are just for our example sleep schedule and our example circadian phase. If your sleep schedule is much later, then all the box would be later, like that. If your schedule is much earlier, then everything would move earlier. So it's relative to your internal clock, not the clock on the wall. In any case, if you take melatonin around bedtime, it's not going to have much of a phase shifting effect, which is good if you're taking it just to help you fall asleep. But if you wake up in the middle of the night and take it to help you get back to sleep, then it can delay you and make things worse. I picked this flight because I thought it might be relevant, to just use it as an example. So this is from DC to Baghdad, and you have to change planes in Germany. So that's 8 time zones. That's the same as going from the West Coast to England. And even though I'm going to show you schedules that have this particular flight in it, the general principles will apply to any flight east across several time zones, not just 8. So here we have the time here in DC, from noon to noon with midnight in the middle. And the yellow just shows when it's daylight here. And these lines show when the light recedes to in the winter when there's less light. Here's the example sleep schedule from 11 to 6. And the bottom shows the equivalent time in Iraq. So when it's noon here, it's 8 p.m. in Iraq. And here you get on the plane Monday afternoon, and you land in Baghdad Tuesday morning. That's why these days of the week are one more than that one, because it changes at midnight. So each row shows the next 24 hours of time. Here's when you want to be sleeping, if you want to sleep at your usual sleep schedule, from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. in Iraq, but that's 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. here, so it's much earlier. I'll tell you about these dotted lines in a minute. It's these kinds of charts can get complicated, and if you're not used to looking at them, I just hope you don't get lost, because you're going to see a lot of these charts. Here's your temperature minimum the day after the flight. It hasn't moved. Your circadian clock hasn't moved. It doesn't know you flew to Iraq, not yet. So it has to get earlier. It has to move to the left to get back into sleep where it belongs. So when should you go outside to help your circadian clock get earlier? Do you remember? You should try to get light after the temperature minimum. And that can help push your clock earlier. The average is about 1 hour each day. So light after the temperature minimum is good for getting earlier. But light before the temperature minimum is the opposite, so you don't want that light. So you should stay indoors in dim light at that time, or if you have to go out, wear very dark sunglasses. Now, even with this perfect light exposure pattern, your temperature minimum doesn't get back into sleep until around 8 days. So you have 7 days of circadian misalignment. That just means that your circadian clock is not aligned with your sleep-wake schedule. So you have to be awake around the sleepiest time of day, around your temperature minimum, and you have to try to sleep at the wrong time also. And these dotted lines just show when it would be the most difficult to sleep, because that time is the furthest from your temperature minimum. So you'll have sleep onset insomnia until your temperature minimum gets back into sleep. If you weren't able to sleep on the plane, then you might be able to sleep that first night back. And even if you are able to sleep every night, either because you're very phase tolerant, which means it's easy for you to sleep at the wrong circadian phase, or if you take sleeping pills, you're still going to be sleepy during the day, in the middle of the afternoon here, around your temperature minimum. So you're not going to be at your best for several days. Here's the same flight, except this time you get a lot of sunlight before the temperature minimum, and you don't get very much after. So this pushes your clock in the delaying direction. So it's delays here, the average is 1.5 hours a day, which is faster than the last slide, which was only an hour. That's because our clocks go faster in the delaying direction. It's easier to delay than advance, and quicker. So this is called antidromic reentrainment, which is just a fancy word for the circadian clock resets in the wrong direction. And this is actually very common after going east across several time zones. And you'll have very bad insomnia, which gradually gets better as your temperature minimum reaches sleep. But still, it's going to take about 10 days for it to get back into sleep, and then you'll be completely over your jet lag. There are many websites that tell you when to seek bright light and when to avoid bright light to help with jet lag. But I can't recommend any of those because I disagree with details. And some of them are just wrong. Some say, well, if you go east, you should get light in the morning. But you can see from this that that's wrong. Here's a case in which the circadian clock gets stuck. Bright outdoor light and the lack of outdoor light first push the clock in one direction, then the other, and it just doesn't make much progress. Now, this might be a rare event, but I know that it has happened that somebody that flies somewhere east, it's very sunny, doesn't phase shift after several days. So, but we don't know how often this would actually happen. We don't have enough research measuring circadian phase after flights. But this is better for going home because your circadian clock is still primarily on home time. But what should you do if you want to adjust to the new time zone? So here's a plan to have less jet lag after flying east by partially resetting your circadian clock before flying. So here's our example sleep schedule from 11 to 6. And the next 2 nights, you go to bed and wake up 1 hour earlier. And you take 3 milligrams of melatonin 7 hours before your usual fall asleep time and 1 hour earlier each day. And you get bright light in the morning. And all of this will make your circadian clock 1 hour earlier a day. So when you land, your temperature minimum is much closer to sleep. So you have less circadian misalignment and less insomnia. And your temperature minimum will reach sleep sooner, so you have fewer days to completely get over your jet lag. As long as you have a little bright light after your temperature minimum. You probably don't even need the melatonin if you're going to have bright light there. So how do we know that afternoon melatonin and morning bright light and shifting your sleep schedule like that will actually advance the clock 1 hour a day before flight? Well, we've tested this in the lab. So I'm going to show you the phase advance shift after 3 days of morning bright light and or afternoon melatonin with sleep advancing 1 hour a day. So with just room light in the morning, you get a very tiny shift, 30 or 40 minutes. There's two different bars here because we had this condition in two different studies. So this is just from going to bed earlier and waking up earlier. When we add melatonin in the afternoon, the phase advances much more, almost doubled. If instead we use a light box in the morning, then the phase shift is even more. And we tested different patterns of bright light, so that's why there's 3 light bars. And when we combine light and melatonin, we get the biggest phase advance, almost an hour a day. So that's the estimate I've been using in the schedules I show you. So we tested these 2 popular doses of melatonin, 3 milligrams and 0.5 milligrams. And there was no significant difference between the size of the phase advance with those 2 doses. But I recommend taking the 3 milligrams because of another study that I'm not going to talk about. So it's better if you can take the 3 unless it makes you too sleepy. And I wouldn't take more than 3. So we did measure sleepiness after taking melatonin in the afternoon. So here's the subjects that got a placebo, and they got sleepier as bedtime approached. So that's the normal pattern. And those that took 0.5 milligrams of melatonin were no different than those that took placebo. And those that took 3 milligrams were a little sleepier. It wasn't significant, but they were a little sleepier, so it's something to consider. So I have to say, you shouldn't drive or operate heavy machinery after taking melatonin until you know how it affects you. But there was a very good controlled study from Switzerland testing driving skills after taking melatonin, and they found no impairment on various tests. And that was after taking 5 milligrams of melatonin in the afternoon. So here's the slide I just showed you. There are 3 days of preparation before the flight and then 3 or 4 days after to get over your jet lag. But there's no rule that says that you have to have 3 days before. You can have more or less. So the more days that you do before the flight, then the less you have to do after. So I've made personalized schedules for people, taking into account their flights and their sleep schedules and other factors. And most of them just do a few days like this. But some wanted to be completely reset to the new time zone as soon as they landed. So we did a lot more days. So I'm thinking of 2 different people. One is a man from Chicago who would visit a woman in Switzerland, and he'd be there for about a week at a time, and I guess he just wanted everything to be perfect. I think it was love. And then there was a man in New York who trained for months for a bicycle race in France. And he had had jet lag before, and he didn't want that to ruin the race. And the race started very early in the morning, so we had to advance him a lot to get him ready. And he said he had no jet lag. And he said around mile 100 of the race, there were people who had given up strewn on the side of the road, gasping and shaking, and some of them crying. He said it looked like a scene from a war movie, but he finished. All right, back to this slide. So here, you're trying to sleep on your usual sleep schedule from 11 to 6. But if you can be a little more flexible with that, then you can have no jet lag by gradually making your sleep earlier after landing. So this is the same 3 days I showed you before. Now the time for the plane is in gray. And here you go to sleep at 3:30 and wake up at 10:30, and then an hour earlier, and then an hour earlier. So you don't try to sleep out of phase with your circadian clock. And this way you'll have no jet lag, no circadian misalignment. So typical advice that you might hear would be start sleeping at the destination time as soon as possible, but I don't think that's always the right advice. So the L's and the S's show you when to get bright light in the morning. It's always better to get outdoor light. But if you have to wake up before sunrise, or it's raining outside or snowing outside, then you need a light box. And I have yellow here covering 3 hours, but you don't need that much light. We have found that intermittent light works very well. So for instance, you could have your coffee in front of the light box and then go take a shower, get dressed, and then you come back and eat breakfast in front of the light box and then do something else and check your mail in front of the light box, or go off, go to work, and maybe you'll get some sunlight there. So intermittent light is good. Now, people who follow these kinds of schedules before the flight don't have trouble falling asleep earlier or waking up earlier because we've advanced their circadian clock. And some of them actually like the extra quiet time in the morning with the light box. But what they don't like is having to go to bed early and miss out on social time or family time. So here, for instance, you'd have to go to bed at 10 p.m. and then 9 p.m. So it's just a matter of what's more important, those couple of nights before the flight or jet lag after the flight. Notice that the time for sleep coincides with the flight, and in this case, you have to cut your sleep short to change planes. But if you had your own plane with a bed, you could make the flight coincide with your sleep time. Or actually, if you take a commercial flight and follow this type of schedule, you try to look for a flight that coincides with sleep. And if you're lucky and you can fly first class, then you get a seat that reclines into a bed. If you have to fly economy or coach, then you may arrive a little sleep deprived. But one night of sleep loss can be made up in a day or two, whereas jet lag is worse and it lasts much longer. If you can't fly first class, maybe you can fly business class. They're coming out with more and more lie-flat business class seats. For short trips, stay on home time and sleep on home time. So don't schedule meetings for the time that you would normally be asleep. This is not rocket science. This is just logical. And you could say, okay, well, I can meet with you at 3 p.m. on, and all night long. And if you have to stay overnight, you should try to sleep at your normal time. In this case, it would be 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. Or you could compromise and advance your rhythms a little, and then you could go to meetings a little earlier and still perform well. All right, let's forget about work for a minute and think about something more pleasant. Let's say you're going to take a vacation in Paris, and you don't want to waste a single day being jet lagged. So you do this little 3-day preparation, same as before. But when you're there, you adopt a later sleep schedule. So here I drew it from 1 a.m. to 9 a.m., and it's 8 hours instead of 7, because after all, you're on vacation. So I find that people misunderstand this 3-day preparation, or whatever day preparation is before the flight. They think, oh, you're just having your jet lag before the flight instead of after. But that's not true, because if you get enough bright light and you take your melatonin at the right time, then your circadian clock will advance and your temperature minimum will stay within sleep and you won't have jet lag. Going home from here is easy because you'll just be on an early sleep schedule. So if you're adapted to this, when you get home, your natural sleep time would be from about 7 till 3, and maybe you could go to bed an hour later, you might wake up at 4 in the morning, so just get up and have something to do, and your clock will naturally delay later. Or if you wanted to get on your regular schedule sooner, you could start to get later at the end of your trip in Paris. Don't schedule things for early in the morning and schedule fun things at night and sleep late and take a late plane. Then you'll be closer to your home time. And if that isn't enough, you can get out your light box and use it before bed, and that will help delay you. So here's a little summary. To reduce or eliminate jet lag, before flying east, you have to get earlier. You have to advance your circadian clock. So advance your sleep 1 hour a day. Get intermittent bright light for 2 to 3 hours after waking. And take 3 milligrams of melatonin 7 hours before home sleep onset and 1 hour earlier each day. Before flying west, you have to get later. You have to delay your circadian clock. I didn't show you any exact schedules like this, but if you wanted to prepare, you could delay your sleep a maximum of 1.5 hours a day and get intermittent bright light in the 2 hours before bed. If you have to go a lot of places around the world, go west. So, for instance, stop off at Hawaii or Alaska, then go to Japan, then the rest of Asia, then the Mideast, and then Europe, and then home. So if you do that slow enough, it'll be easier on your body than lots of short little trips back and forth. I'd like to thank the National Institutes of Health. My research has been almost exclusively supported by NIH. Some of what you saw today was from grants from the National Institute of Nursing Research and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And before that, we had grants from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. And Doctors Burgess, Revel, Crowley, and Smith contributed the most to the data I showed you. And that's my email address, and thanks for listening. Questions? Oh, yes.
You talked about melatonin possibly causing sleepiness for a long time. Is there any evidence that melatonin might have other side effects or interact with receptor?
Could you repeat the question,
The
please?
question is, will melatonin have other side effects besides sleepiness? Well, there have been reports of other side effects, but sometimes it's just from jet lag. Melatonin in general is very safe. You can't kill mice with it. They tried, to see what would kill half the mice, and they got up to 800 milligrams a kilogram, and they didn't die. And they couldn't get the concentration any more concentrated. So it's a very safe thing, except for the sleepiness. But, I guess you have to watch out for the sleepiness, and I should say, since we don't know that much about what melatonin is for in humans, that pregnant women, nursing women probably shouldn't take it, and maybe kids shouldn't take it, although they give it to kids with developmental disorders a lot. It helps their sleep. Yes?
I don't know whether they're relevant or not. I'm just curious about newborn babies and then elderly people. They are also sleeping longer hours. Do they have a more melatonin released?
When you're younger, you have more melatonin. And as you get older, approach puberty, the amount goes down. And then there are some reports of less melatonin in the elderly, but some very healthy elderly people have normal amounts of melatonin. Actually, all of us are different in the amount of melatonin we have. It's a huge variation, and nobody really knows why. Nobody has linked it to anything yet.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how do people who live, for instance, like in Northern Europe or the Northern United States, Canada, how do their circadian rhythms change when you response to a different amount of sunlight we get?
Well, not that much because we have Edison and electric lights, so people keep to a sleep schedule. The perceived light-dark cycle includes the indoor light. There are some people who get later in the winter because there's less light in the morning, because morning light advances you. They have more winter depression in the north.
I'm wondering if there are any non-jet lag related applications to your research.
Oh yeah, we study shift work. It's another man-made disorder with circadian misalignment and many health problems associated with it. So we study how to shift night workers to the night shift, and actually been working on a compromise because it's easy to shift them all the way to the night shift, but then they're out of sorts on days off. So we've been working on something in between. Then there's people with the delayed sleep phase syndrome. That's just extreme night owls. And they can use the kind of schedules I showed you for advancing to get on an earlier schedule.
If you're talking about taking melatonin 7 hours before you fly, if you're working on the days before you fly, that means somewhere between 2:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to have to stop really.
Well, you take it 7 hours before your usual sleep time, not before you fly. So yeah, if it makes you sleepy and you're working, that would be bad. In that case, I'd say take a smaller dose, which is unlikely to make you sleepy, like 0.5, and just get more bright light in the morning.
With the light box, does the light actually have to, penetrate your eyes? I mean, or does
Yes, it works through the retina. It has to go in your eyes. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's no easy solution to this. Yeah, there's nothing.
You got it.
It doesn't require self-discipline.
Yes, it requires some discipline and lifestyle changes, but I think the things I showed you are easier to do than losing weight or quitting smoking or something like that.
To prevent jet lag, most of what you're talking about refers to discipline changes, but are there any better times to fly? Or is it a red-eye flight worse for you to prevent jet lag?
Well, like I showed you, I only showed you one flight. If you want to get light right after, if getting light right after you land is good, then you want to, it depends on how many time zones you're crossing and whether you are planning to advance your rhythms or delay them. And the time of the flight matters a lot because that shapes the light and dark that you get as soon as you land. And I don't have a rule in my head. I graph it out and I say, oh yeah, this would be a better flight. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you looked into it all, sort of what effects taking sleeping pills would have during that adjustment period. So say that you just can't sleep on a plane, you just like stay awake, so you have a pill before that flight to carry you through. Is that going to sort of screw up the process?
Okay, sleeping pills and stimulants. I made slides for this because I thought somebody might ask. So those can help you, can help diminish the symptoms of jet lag, but they don't shift you, so they don't take away they don't fix the underlying problem of circadian misalignment. So these are the most popular short-acting sleeping pills for jet lag, especially Ambien. But these have problems, such as transient global amnesia, especially if combined with alcohol. And you're not supposed to drink and take the pills, but people do. So there's all these really interesting stories of so-called traveler's amnesia, where somebody takes Ambien to sleep on the plane, and then they land, and they go through customs, and they check into their hotel, and they have lunch, and have a conversation with somebody, and the next day they can't remember any of it. And then there's also so-called Ambien zombies. This is more just from taking Ambien at home, maybe combined with alcohol. And people end up going to the refrigerator and eating vast quantities of strange things, and they don't remember it the next day. Or even worse, they drive and end up in a hospital or in jail and don't remember anything. So there's also hangover effects because the drugs leave the body gradually. So it depends on when you wake up relative to when you took the pill. If you take it many days in a row and then stop, you can have drug withdrawal insomnia or rebound insomnia. If you take it for many days, tolerance can build up, and then you need to take a bigger dose, and there are adverse events to taking these drugs: nausea, vomiting, confusion, and headache. So I'd say if you're going to take these pills, take as little as possible.
Are there any long-term studies that look at the negative impact on throwing off your circadian rhythm, for example, fertility?
Yes, the menstrual cycle is messed up. A lot of that is done in flight attendants. It's the same is true for shift work. Yes, throwing off your circadian rhythms has a lot of adverse effects. Yeah.
Sorry, in your research, did you see if there was any noticeable difference between men and women, if they could adjust their clocks faster or not?
We didn't see anything like that. I have not heard of any differences in phase shifting between men and women. The only difference is sometimes women have a slightly earlier circadian phase.
There's a situation, what they call the highway hypnosis. If you are driving in the daytime and a very flat land, several hours, and then you feel really sleepy. Anything has to do with the melatonin release?
Well, there's no melatonin in the body then, in the middle of the day, especially if it's light out, because it would suppress it. No, it's just many of us are too sleep deprived, and the middle of the day, siesta time, is a natural time to sleep, and sleep deprivation and monotony, and boom, there you go.
How do you actually know when your T-min is?
When is your T-min? Well, if you stay up all night, there's going to be a point in time when you're kind of cold and you think you can't go on, and then you'll get better. That was your T-min. Or if you sleep 7 hours, I drew mine 2 hours before wake. That's sort of, an estimate. I would estimate it from your most usual sleep time.
For people who change their bedtime by 2, 3, or 4 hours every weekend, are they experiencing Monday a kind of jet lag?
Oh yeah, right. So it's very easy to get later. So on the weekend they get later, and then come Sunday night they can't fall asleep, and come Monday morning they're sleep deprived. Yeah, that's definitely, it's going east. It's easy to go west. That's the weekend. Hard to go back to work. That's east. Yeah, and the night owls do that the most. And yeah, it's something I had to try to give up. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.